There's a grave concern felt throughout the world that automation is making human labor superfluous. And if you think about it, many of the great inventions of the last 200 years were specifically designed to eliminate human labor. So tractors were created to replace animal and human muscle power with internal combustion engines. The assembly line, excuse me, just trying to, oh, great. The Industrial Revolution, the assembly line was created to replace kind of slow, inaccurate artisanal labor with machine precision. And the computer was built to eliminate cumbersome, error-prone calculation and replace it with digital perfection. And by and large, these inventions have worked. We no longer dig ditches by hand. We don't pound tools out of wrought iron. We don't do bookkeeping with actual books. And yet, throughout the century, in most of the industrialized world, the fraction of the population working in the paid labor force has increased, not declined. A lot of that reflects, of course, the movement of women out of unpaid, constrictive domestic labor into the formal labor market, where they can exercise their skills and their creativity and their expertise. So there are 3 points I want to talk about in the next few minutes. First of all, why are there still so many jobs remaining despite all this automation? 2, what is new work and where does it come from? And 3, how do we shape the future of work? So let me start with the first question. Why are there still so many jobs? There's a 3-part answer. The first 2 I think will be familiar, and I think the third part will be less so. So let me start with the first, insatiability. Never get enough. Here's a picture of the US family, the Caven family, and all of their worldly possessions, taken in 1985, 35 years ago by Peter Menzel, a photographer. And they were kind enough to empty their entire house onto their lawn. And you can see, in addition to their large and modern house, they have a spacious lawn, and it is filled with bookshelves and appliances and bicycles and toys and bedding and patio umbrellas and so on. And so there's a tremendous amount of belongings here, far in excess of any notion of necessity. But of course, they would consider that normal. And if you were to do the same exercise today, you would find twice as much house and 3 times as many belongings. So in other words, as productivity rises and people become wealthier, their consumption rises about 1 for 1 with those increases, and that creates a lot of demand and therefore tends to create work. So one reason we don't run out of work, run out of jobs, is because we're never satisfied. People always want to consume more as their wealth increases. A second reason, and I think just as fundamental, is when we think about automation and new technologies, we think about them replacing labor, and they do that. That's absolutely the case. But they don't exclusively do that. They also augment us. So think if you're a medical doctor now, you have access to hundreds of different diagnostic tests for blood, for x-rays, for bone graft, for bone tissue, et cetera, et cetera. These things replace a lot of labor-intensive work that medical doctors and technicians would have done 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, but they do not make doctors less valuable or less necessary. They make them more valuable because they can do a better job of pinpointing medical disease, health issues, and treating them. And so the advances in testing, yes, they eliminate some human tasks, but they augment human labor. But you don't need to look to just high-tech fields. If you're a roofer, having access to a pneumatic nail gun dramatically increases the speed with which you can work, the amount you can accomplish, the value of your labor, and even the difficulty of the jobs you can do. If you're an educator, having access to the internet, it doesn't just reduce the need for educators, it changes the way we teach and changes the tools that we use, and hopefully allows us to perform more and reach a broader audience of students worldwide. Or even if you're a truck driver, having access to routing software means you never have to carry an empty load, you never have to do what's called deadheading. You can either collaborate or compete with large companies. So in all these ways, technology doesn't just eliminate work, it augments work and increases the value of human labor and complements the knowledge and expertise and creativity that we bring to work. That's the second point. The third one I want to focus on is new work, new demands for human expertise and specialization. Let me illustrate what I mean. What is new work? So let's take the job of marketing, selling stuff. So there are some timeless tasks, forming hypotheses, proposing analyses, staring at results, starting again. That's basically the line of work I'm in. There are tasks that have been automated, estimating new models, estimating statistical models, testing for their significance, generating tables and figures. Then there are new work. These are new jobs that have been created over the last 4 decades, found in US data. Applied statistician, added in 1980, director of marketing research and analysis, or a data visualization developer. These are all new forms of specialization associated with marketing and research that didn't exist 50 years ago. Let me give you another example. It doesn't have to be high tech. Let's talk about fitness training. So there are some timeless tasks, the grunting and the sweating, the agony and the ecstasy. There are some tasks that are now done by machinery, measurement, timekeeping, heart rate pace, or equipment adjustment, resistance, weight. All these things are now done for us by our tools. There's also new work. Here are some new jobs added to the US economy over the last couple of decades. A sports psychologist in 2000, a sports nutritionist, or certified therapeutic recreation specialist. So you can see that there's this process of a certain set of tasks being automated, and then new needs for human specialization coming into existence. So let me say more about this. What is new work and where does it come from? So how do we find it? Well, in research that I've done with co-authors Anna Solomons of Utrecht University and Brian Segmiller of MIT, we go back through historical US Census volumes from the last 100 years. And the US Census Bureau, collects a population census each year, and they ask, each decade, and they ask people what they do. And then they make a catalog of all those responses. They use that to help kind of classify things. So there, in each given decade, there may be 10, 20, 30,000 different categories of responses. Those won't appear in the published work, but they will appear in the data that the Census Bureau collects and classifies. So let me give you some examples of some of those. So between 1940 and 2018, here are some new titles that people began reporting to the US Census Bureau they previously hadn't reported. So in 1940, an automatic welding machine operator. In 1960, a textile chemist. In 1980, a controller of remotely piloted vehicles. In 2000, artificial intelligence specialist. 2018, a pediatric vascular surgeon. Now you might look at the list and say, oh, I see. New work is about people who use new machines, design new machines, repair new machines, sell new machines, etc. Let me give you a second set of examples. On the right, these are also new titles that came online in those same decades. So an acrobatic dancer, a pageant director, a hypnotherapist, an amusement park worker, a sommelier, a drama therapist. These are new services. Those titles are just as prevalent as the new technology-based titles. And they are not specifically about technology or changing tools. They actually reflect changing incomes, tastes, even demographics, the aging of the population, all of which change the demand for human skills and specialization. So new work is not just about using new machines. It's about providing services that people demand. And just to give you some sense of, well, how do we know these titles are meaningful? We actually took the census titles and we went through what's called Google Ngram Viewer that basically records their frequency of occurrence in the US English language, and you can see in books, in the English language, you can see that as these titles enter the Census Bureau classification, we also see them appearing in books published in the English language. So in all cases, this just verifies that these titles are, in fact, what people are reporting is what they're talking about in that time period. Now, let me emphasize, well, what is distinct about new work? What makes work new? Well, the most important thing about new work is it requires some special expertise. It requires some knowledge that not everybody possesses. So to be high paid, for a job to pay well, it needs to have skills that are scarce. So for example, some titles that we saw up there: data visualization developer, an inspector of sanitation, a tattoo artist, a therapeutic recreation specialist, a sommelier, that's the person who sells you expensive fancy wine in an expensive restaurant, or a home mortgage disclosure act specialist. These are all activities that require people to acquire some knowledge specific to that activity that not everybody has, and yet people want access to. It's important to recognize that non-specialized work tends to pay poorly, even when it's socially valuable. Waiters, checkout clerks, housekeepers, security guards, daycare teachers, home health aides, crossing guards, these are really valuable positions. They do things that are important. They take care of our kids and our elderly. They don't tend to pay well because many people are capable of doing them. So when I talk about new work, it doesn't just mean more work. It means work that requires expertise. And that's where value for human labor is created. How much does new work matter? Well, here's one way to see that. In 1940, employment in the US formal labor market was around 40 million people, a little bit above that. In 2018, there are about 50 million people doing the jobs that existed in 1940, those narrow titles. However, there's about 140 million people who are working. In other words, about 2/3, a little more than 60% of all work that people are doing in 2018 is in new specialized activities that were not present in 1940. So a lot of the work that we do today is new. That's an important part of the process. And just to give you some sense, this shows you a figure that shows occupations in which we see new titles emerging, these new specialized activities like sommeliers. And on the vertical axis, you see the growth of employment in those occupations. So let me just give you a couple of examples to highlight why this is illuminating. So you can see on the top right here, oh, look, lots of computer scientists, computer software developers. You knew that, right? Of course, new work, new activities. Okay, but it's not just technology people. We also see new titles and new growth among registered nurses, among childcare workers, among hairdressers and cosmetologists, among psychologists or veterinarians. Conversely, we see declines among mechanical engineers, laundry and dry cleaning workers, butchers and meat cutters, machinists, bank tellers, printing machine operators. These are all activities in which there is not new emergence of new specialized work. And when new specialized work stops growing, employment tends to decline. So that brings us to a useful distinction between different forms of technological change and their interaction with workers. In our work, we distinguish between what we call augmentation and automation. Augmentation means adding value to worker tasks, fostering specialization, increasing the value of what people do. Automation means substituting worker tasks, reducing worker scarcity. And technological advances do both, often at the same time. They eliminate some things, they create new demand for others. It doesn't have to be one for one. We show in our work that where you see augmentation occurring, as measured by patents and other forms of innovation, that's where you see new titles emerging and employment growing. I won't spend the time on that. That's not true, however, for automation. Where we see new automation innovations occurring, new technologies that replace labor, we see employment shrinking. So there's an important distinction to be made here. Not all innovations augment labor, not all innovations automate labor, and we have control over that process, or at least some control over that. And I'll say more about that in my final minutes. So let me turn to the question. I've said, work is changing. There's things that are being automated away. There are new work that's being created. How do we shape the future of work? Is that just a passive process? And the answer is no. So I had the privilege of co-leading the MIT task force on the work of the future over the last 2 years. And we looked at 5 different technologies, major technologies: autonomous vehicles, industrial robotics, intelligent supply chains, additive manufacturing, and artificial intelligence, and tried to understand the trajectory of the technology and their implications for labor markets. And I can summarize in a sentence what we found, which is that the momentous impacts of technological change are unfolding gradually. 2 keywords there: momentous and gradually. These are hugely transformative technologies. I'm sure you're aware, autonomous vehicles got a lot of newspaper press, and then they kind of belly flopped, but they will be very important 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now. Same with industrial robotics, intelligent supply chains, additive manufacturing, and I don't need to sell you on the idea that artificial intelligence is important. However, these things are not happening overnight. They happen slowly, and that gives us time to adjust, to adapt, and to shape them in the directions that we want to go. How do we shape them? Well, in part, it depends upon investment. If you look at the distribution of US innovations over the last 100 years, from 1900 to 220, you'll see that there's been basically 3 different eras of innovation. In the first part of the 20th century, it was the machine age, new machines, mostly in manufacturing. In the second part of the 20th century, from the Second World War to around 1980, a lot of our innovation was focused in chemistry and metallurgy, the kind of age of better living through chemistry. And then since 1980, most innovation has been focused on instruments and information, electricity and electronics, and in health. And this changes what jobs are augmented and what are automated. As we've moved into the information age, increasingly the jobs that are most affected are professional, technical, and managerial work, health services work, and office work. And a lot of the traditional blue-collar work has been automated. So by choosing where to invest, we shape the type of work that people will be doing. Let me give you one concrete example before I conclude. During the COVID crisis, you're all aware of the rise of telepresence. So what do I mean by telepresence? Telepresence is a term that actually came out of deep sea exploration, remotely piloted vehicles, often underwater exploring vehicles, where people were not present physically, but they were telepresent. Their eyes and their ears were transported to the locations where these machines were being deployed. And we now see that in remotely piloted aircraft or in robotically assisted surgery. We are now in an era of telepresence in the office through virtual conferences, remote learning, distance medicine, the work from home economy, what we are doing right here today. Why was COVID so important? It wasn't a technological change. The technology had been available for many years. Many of us were using Skype or Zoom prior to the crisis. What COVID did was it solved the coordination problem. The miracle is not that I'm using Zoom, or that you're using Zoom, it's that we're all using it simultaneously, that we've agreed that this is a suitable substitute for being there in person. Not a perfect substitute, but better than nothing. Well, why is that so important? Well, for one thing, it's going to change the way we travel. When I originally agreed to give this talk, I hoped I would be in Santiago today. Instead, I'm in my home office. I think I would have liked Santiago better. But it changes the texture of cities and downtowns, because a lot of those big cities are driven by, or a big part of what they do is people come in on airplanes and they take taxis and limos, and they stay at expensive hotels and they go out to restaurants. We'll see a lot less of that. Simultaneously, it changes the way that people work. This figure from a recent work by Barraro, Bloom, and Davis points out that people who work in dense urban settings spend a lot of money near their offices every week. What do they spend money on? They spend money on, on food, on coffee, on transportation, on entertainment, on shopping. It turns out that after the pandemic, employers expect that people who work in dense urban areas will work from home much more, right? Those expensive professionals who spent a lot of money downtown will now be spending many more days at home. Well, one implication of that is that innovation itself will be changed by the way people work. So again, this is a paper from Bloom, Davis, and their co-author Zetskova, showing patenting activity in innovations that support working from home. So you can see between 2010 and early 2020, there was a very small and very stable share of all patents that mentioned working from home. In the short period from January 2020 to July 2020, that fraction doubled. In other words, innovation was directed by the change in economic activity. And you can be sure that those innovations will augment the workers who are working from home, allowing them to be more productive, to communicate more efficiently, to do the work better. So you can see in real time how Economics interacts with technology to shape the direction of innovation and the way that we work. So let me conclude. We're not running out of jobs. As I said already, the question is not one of job quantity. In fact, it's one of job quality, something I don't have time to talk about today, but we'd be delighted to speak about on another occasion. The challenge is shaping the future of work. As I said from the start, there's a pervasive fear that technological innovation will render our skills redundant. But innovation need not just automate work. It can also augment it, as we have discussed. As a society, we shape the future of work by choosing where to invest, what to augment, and what to automate. As individuals, we shape our own futures by adapting to opportunity and moving up the value chain. The majority of today's jobs had yet to be invented a century ago. The job of the present is to shape a future that we want to inhabit and that we want our children to inherit. Thank you very much.